Hello, everybody, and welcome to
Recording
this
in
open
progress.
session of the Committee on Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain. We appreciate you all being here, especially our distinguished panelists. Because this is an open session, I have a boilerplate statement that I need to read, so I apologize for reading this, but here goes. As chair of the Committee on Security of America's Medical Product Supply Chain, I would like to welcome everyone. I want to note that this is an open on-the-record information gathering session. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be extremely mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions and that it would be a mistake for anyone to leave here thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the Academies. For those of you not familiar with the committee process, this is a committee information gathering session. Some of the committee's meetings include public sessions, like this one, where we will have the opportunity to hear from experts. The committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its draft report. Moreover, once the draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee then must respond to this review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the Academy's Report Review Committee and the chair of the National Research Council before it is considered an NRC report. The expected report release of this study is the first quarter of 2022. Further information on the study, including future meetings, can be found on the project website. In this study, the committee is being asked to first assess and evaluate the dependence of the U.S., including the private commercial sector, states, and the federal government, on critical drugs and devices that are sourced or manufactured outside the U.S. And second, to provide recommendations to improve the resilience of the supply chain for critical drugs and devices and address supply vulnerabilities or potential disruptions of such products that would significantly affect or pose a threat to public health, security, or national security. Today, the public session will focus on the medical device supply chain and the committee's economic analysis. In the interest of time, speakers will be introduced by name, title, and affiliation. During the Q&A discussion, only the committee will be able to ask questions and provide comments. To ensure adequate time for discussion with the committee, I'd like to ask the speakers to keep prepared remarks to the allotted time of 5 to 7 minutes or so at the beginning, and we will provide warnings when your time is nearly up. Okay, that ends my obligatory statement. So as I said, we're here to talk about the medical device supply chain in contrast to the drug supply chain, which we've dealt with a lot in this committee. So, as I said, we have about 15 minutes or so for presentations and then about 60 minutes for discussion. So we have 3 speakers, which I will introduce in turn, and we would ask you to say about 5 to 7 minutes with your introductory remarks. And then once we're done, we'll go into Q&A and have an open and frank discussion. All right? All right, so ready to go. Our first speaker today is Mark Rudkowitz, who is Vice President of Quality at Innovise. Mark, the floor is yours.
Hi, let's go to, there, can you hear me? Okay,
Yep, loud and clear.
let's go to the next slide. I'm just going to cover quickly what the shortage and risk examples are in the industry I've seen over the last, 5 years, and that's going to help explain where I think gaps are in the system. Sort of the state of the U.S. medical device manufacturing. I did a lot of research also on what's in the FDA and what they have for establishments in the U.S. Talk a little bit about what is the supply chain design is, what kind of manufacturers are there for medical devices versus, you guys have focused on pharma, and then some recommendations of some of the stuff projects that the industry has been working with the FDA on and where we can go as a longer term solution that might help you guys. So next slide. So the risk areas, let's just click through here. We can just get to the pandemic is one risk area that's caused the current committee what we're looking at today, but natural disasters can cause issues on supply chain recalls, trade embargoes, critical facility shutdowns by other regulators, and changes in other industries. So the examples here, the next slide, go through some of those. So one of the examples here, the largest U.S. syringe production is done by Becton Dickinson in Holdridge, Nebraska. Why do they pick Holdridge, Nebraska? They talk about this all the time. It is the farthest away from any major city. So in case of a nuclear strike, they can still build syringes there. So that was why they built that in the 50s. The next one is sutures. A lot of the sutures in the U.S. are all made by Ethicon in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is very prone to hurricanes. They haven't been shut down significantly with the last couple of hurricanes in the last 5 years, but that is a big area. Next one in the U.S., DuPont ended up changing Tyvek, some of their manufacturing equipment, and it took 5 years to get through the entire process of equivalency, the way the process and works with the FDA, and that could have caused some significant issues in the supply chain if they had gone down. That's the Tyvek is used as a main ETO sterilization barrier in like most companies using ETO. Next one is aluminum films used in medical device and pharma packaging. The trade embargo that happened like a few years ago, the U.S. had a lot of thin film aluminum manufacturing here, moved to China for cost issues. And then when the trade embargo happened, it just caused a huge delay in the supply chain. Another one example is just last year, Illinois EPA shut down Sterigenics ETO sterilizer facility. 594 products had to find new sterilization methods. It was like 1 day notice. So that had a big effect on the supply chain in the US. And then the Texas freeze actually is causing a huge delay right now on adhesives that are used in class 1 medical devices. 6+ weeks delay in delivery from that weather event. So that's just an example of how this medical device industry is affected by these types of different events. Next slide. So the types of suppliers that the FDA defines, and we can just scroll through all of these here. Medical device manufacturers, they're called specification developers. They can be either vertically integrated, like a Medtronic is vertically integrated, a lot of the components are there, or a hybrid approach where some of the assembly is done by the manufacturer and then they outsource a lot to contractors. And there's lots of small medical device manufacturers that are totally virtual. There's basically 4 or 5 people and they outsource everything. There's a lot of contract manufacturers that just build medical devices and then they sell them to the OEMs or distributors. There's lots of distributors, and actually one of the top 12 of the top 12 medical device manufacturers in the U.S. Well, 2 of them, Cardinal Health and Medline. Medline is just really a pure distributor, is one of the largest manufacturers, but they outsource all their builds. Then there's custom component manufacturers just in the medical device industry. And then there's a lot of service providers for the industry. The main ones are packagers, sterilizers, and analytical labs. So that's sort of the ecosystem that the medical device supply chain lives in. Next slide. So the U.S. medical manufacturing, this is data from the FDA's registration. In 2020, there was 6,750 manufacturing sites in the U.S., which is only 24% of the registered sites. So 75% of manufacturer sites are outside the U.S. Contract manufacturers, this is interesting that there's more contract manufacturers in the U.S. than standard manufacturing sites. And there's 62 U.S. sterilization sites. The FDA has registered. That's only 30% of the total. The rest are outside the U.S. Just in comparison, ISO certification to 1345 is med device focused. There's only 3,300 facilities registered in the U.S., which is a small percentage of the worldwide. And then ISO 9000, another quality system that's not med device specific. There's more, but there's not a lot compared to overall what U.S. manufacturers. Next slide. So the critical supplies, the types of components that med device deals with is raw and plastic process films, and those are the main suppliers of those films. And most of those are U.S. based. Savic and Bayer are non-U.S. Plastics manufacturers. Plastic injection molder extruders, those provide a big chunk of medical devices that are done in the U.S. Biologic tissues reagent suppliers, metals, these are the metals that are really looking at that affect most medical devices. The sterilizers themselves, printed circuit board assemblies and touch screens, and a lot of that's done in Asia right now. Electronic components and batteries, and that's key here also for the industry. Tooling equipment supply is critical, especially for making automated machines, and that really affected the pandemic for increasing PPE production. Adhesives and inks, like I said, we had a delay here with Texas freeze, causing these materials to be not available to finish making the medical device. So that's sort of the ecosystem on that. The one thing that I think we hadn't talked about that is the information supply chain as part of the medical device supply chain. The FDA sets requirements for document and record control, but not how to implement that. So medical devices are really part-centric. In order to build a medical device, manufacturers need a bill of material, a BOM, that gives you the structure of how to do it. Pharma is more document-centric, recipe-based on how you make the parts. So how you share that information is a lot different. Each company determines how they want to do that information supply chain infrastructure, the tools, their policies. Everybody's different. And one company's policies don't align with another company, and you can't, one company can't give another company their, BOM in one day. It typically takes a quarter to understand all the translations that have to happen to make sure you do that consistently. Each company, the only requirement on information supply chain that's now available, and that's just actually in the last 5 years, the FDA has a UDI, Universal Device Identifier, which is the very top level component. But even that, we don't have standardization because you can use two methodologies, one's GS1 and one's HIBIC. And there's no standards in the industry for product information sharing. Doc type, part types, change types, event types, BOM structures. There's no standards at all. So that industry is very diverse that way. So that doesn't allow that and makes it more difficult to rapidly move and expand the supply chain in case of an event. So last slide is recommendations that we probably things to talk about today. What are critical devices and volume ramp up goals? How do you expand, incentivize use of automation? Because that's how, Innovize, the company I'm at, we're a contract manufacturer. We do high volume class 1 type devices. We have people use us instead of going to China even because we're automating the process instead of using hand labor. So robotics and vision systems, it's using use of AI software and additive manufacturing totally makes us more competitive to the Asian manufacturers. We want to expand the use of contract manufacturers. They're typically more flexible because we're designed to build different products every day. That's what we do. If there's tax advantages, that'd be great for key products manufactured in the US. I think we need to talk about defining quality system information and product architecture standards so that people can share information quickly. And lastly, I've been working with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. So that's a group, public-private partnership between the FDA and the medical device industry. There's like a dozen different working groups within that to help the industry and FDA work together. And I think that would be a great group to create a new organization. If we need something implemented, that group would be a great way to go forward. That's it. I have backup slides, but we don't need to look at them today, right now.
Fantastic, Mark. That was very nicely done. And so what I'm going to do is ask us to hold our questions until we've gotten through all three of the speakers, and then we'll come back and maybe some of those backup slides will come into play in the Q&A part. Okay. So with that, our next speaker is Noel Colon, who's a Senior Vice President and Chief Quality Officer at Medtronic. Noel, are you ready to go?
All right, yes. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us to discuss this important topic. And I want to say thank you specifically to George and the committee for addressing this topic. And we are happy to participate in this and contribute with our voice and our feedback on the topic. And looking forward to have a good conversation and be able to provide more information when we go to the Q&A session. But let me turn the meeting now to Greg Smith. He is the EVP and for Global Operations and Supply Chain. And John Klein will discuss the topics of supply chain consideration. So go ahead, Greg.
Oh, thank you. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. If you could flip the page, please. We thought we'd do is just give you a little bit of a grounding around overview of our overall supply chain and global operations here at Medtronic. And as Mark said earlier, the networks are very complicated and they're very extended. And so to give you a little specifics, I'm going to take you through the asset base that we have, the way that we go to market. We, as you know, are one of the largest medical device companies in the world. And then John's going to join me, and he's going to talk a little bit more about supply chain resilience around the challenges that, in our perspective, of things that have to be overcome. To give you context for Medtronic, we do business in over 150 countries today, and we have a number of active SKUs that are in excess of 100,000. So very complicated, significant number of lines of business, and then a lot of detailed products, as you can imagine, that vary by size and actually vary by type. And from customers that we serve over 400,000 customers across the globe. You'll see a representation as I show you a map here, but you'll know that we're a very global company. As we seek to conclude our business or conduct our business, we have a lot of work, obviously, that goes into the overall processes and the work that we have to do to actually plan and to procure and to bring items together, whether those are items that we actually make ourselves or whether they're actually ones that we have manufactured for us through contract manufacturers. Through that network, we have a very extensive asset base. And we do leverage, for a number of different reasons, contract manufacturers. Some of those are very strategic. Some of those are more opportunistic. Some have high volumes. Some of them have relatively low volumes. We use thousands of suppliers. So, we have a multitude of different locations, even within the suppliers that we have today, but a very extensive amount of supply base across the globe that services the components that we put into our products that we manufacture. We have 59 distribution centers around the globe. So think about when we produce or procure from our contract manufacturers. We have 66 different manufacturing locations globally. We ship those through 59 distribution centers across the globe. And then we forward deploy from those 59 to another 70 forward stocking locations. We are shipping about 60,000 shipments a day. A shipment can range from one individual item to a bulk or a pallet. And we have to also, as part of our process, as was mentioned by Mark earlier, sterilization is a key component of our process. So post our contract manufacturing, post our manufacturing, we typically go to a sterilization process and then forward on further through the network. If you look at then how we go to market, it's also a very extended supply chain. We have distributors. We will sell and go directly to hospitals. We have a sales force that's made up of people selling, but we also have a very extensive group of representatives that are actually working with the doctors, in a lot of cases within the operating rooms, to help consult and to help them to make sure they're up to speed on the latest processes needed to leverage our products. We go directly to physicians' offices, and then ultimately, in some cases, more like diabetes and areas, we'll have a direct relationship with a patient. It doesn't go necessarily through a third party. If you please go to the next slide. You can see the dots kind of represent our coverage around the globe. And again, as I said, very extensive, a lot of global movements. We have the supply network that is set up to service our patients across those 150 countries. We have our manufacturing segregated, meaning that in some cases we will have shared manufacturing facilities that will make a multitude of different products. In some cases, we have very focused factories that will make just one line of product or will produce our products in that location for that line of product. And then we also have global technology and competency centers where we'll have very core technology or very core capabilities that we might have in one or two locations, but they're also very closely clustered with research and development that helps us continue to advance the technology and the capabilities. Like I said, extensive distribution network. Some of that network is made up of Medtronic-run facilities of distribution. Others are third-party. Some are distributors. And if you look at it all in total, there are probably over 1,000 nodes that we use where we actually stock the locations, products in the locations to have them forward deployed so that they're ready for the need at the time the patient or the physician or the hospital has the need. I'd now like to introduce you to John Klein. John is our Chief Procurement Officer here at Medtronic, and he's going to take you through and he manages all of our supply base. He manages all of our contract manufacturing, and he'll take you through some of the specifics of the challenges that we see within the industry. John?
Well, thanks, Greg. Thank you. Yeah, if we go to the next slide. I'll try to be relatively quickly for the sake of time, but I try to group it in 5 major areas in terms of the challenges that we see in medtech. And really, a lot of it is around the fact that there is this very interconnected global supply chain you saw from Greg, and that really speaks to our supply base. The developing markets, if you will, have been growing probably at a rate of 3 times faster than the more mature markets like the United States. And so as a result, a lot of suppliers are being developed outside the United States, and they've been growing very significantly at a significant pace, probably the last decade. And the challenge too is a lot of our suppliers are very small. They're privately held. They're highly specialized. They will sometimes come from regulated environments like aerospace, sometimes other industries that will try to move into medtech because it's appealing to them. But there's just a lot of very small privately held ones that add some complexity to where we're sourcing from. The manufacturing flexibility is limited. Their ability to pick up and move is controlled by the fact there's a lot of quality control at all steps. And I'll address that here in the next slide in terms of what that means and how that impacts our ability to source and have the latitude of picking suppliers. And as you can appreciate on the fourth area there, the OEMs, which is us, Medtronic, we all have different quality processes and process requirements. So ourselves and our competitors have different ways of going about quality, different design requirements, processes, and from end to end, which do add cost to suppliers. It's difficult for supplier to service one OEM in a consistent way across the continuum. And then, as Greg, you saw on the previous slide, Greg showed there's this last mile delivery, a lot of resilience and reliance on the outside, 3PLs and people of that nature that have to prioritize medtech. And it's not always that they know it's coming from Medtronic or one of our competitors. Sometimes it's sub-tier assemblies that have to come to our plants, and they have no idea that that component is actually going into a life-saving device. And so there's a lot of challenges with transparency in the supply base. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to go a little more detail in each of these areas, provide a little bit more color on these things. So the first one, as I mentioned, the challenge is with a lot of the stuff that we produce. When you think about the human body, all the different sizes and shapes, we don't have kind of one catheter or one stent that fits all. And as a result, there's a lot of changeover, a lot of setup time at our component suppliers, which requires a lot of manual touching. There's a lot of inspections, so a lot of labor costs that go in, not only direct labor, but also indirect labor. And so as a result, there's a tendency to chase low-cost country sources of supply. We like to call it best cost country because we take a look at the total cost of ownership, the supply chain movement costs, but it is out there and a challenge that we have to continue to overcome. And we certainly, like Mark shared earlier, making sure we have the ability to support critical quality components in the United States is very, very important. I think everybody's very familiar with the semiconductor challenges. A lot of those semiconductors and the wafer fabrication have moved offshore, which provides us a challenge to make sure we're protecting those supply chains into medtech. The second area there, in terms of the size and scale of the device buy, is fragmented. Our suppliers like to sell in tons, and unfortunately, we purchase in pounds. And so we tend to buy very small, fractional quantities. And because it's very specialized, it doesn't allow us a big latitude to do that. And so we're certainly always eager to see where there's industry consolidation possibilities and promoting that to make sure that we grow size and scale of our supply base to allow them that flexibility and capability that does that. The third item on lot traceability is, you can appreciate, qualities of a paramount importance, and we work with all the regulatory bodies, and a lot of their procedures and requirements are very complex, and of course we have to put those onto our supply base. And so what happens is we tend to single source very high. We have to design to a specific piece of equipment, design to a specific resin, design to all these requirements, and so it limits our ability to move quickly. So as we have this global supply chain, it adds that layer of complexity that's already there. Working with outside partners like Medicred to try to standardize the auditing, the approval process is certainly a step in the right direction that we want to continue to explore and push more on. And then the quality requirements that I mentioned, while it's important and obviously a necessity for us, it sometimes limits people's willingness to come in. We sometimes try to work with larger consumer products companies, and when they look at the requirements, the size of the spend, it's kind of like, well, hey, thanks, we're going to continue to knock out high volume products for consumer industries and other industries. And so medtech's a little bit unique and specialized in that way, where we're constantly trying to figure out how to entice more people, particularly domestically, into the medtech space. And as I mentioned on that last mile, just making sure that transparency is there, making sure they understand that component goes into a medical technology device is very of paramount importance. And we have to continue to make sure we've got those capabilities and abilities to get the prioritization, show that transparency, and make sure all of our facilities are supplied with the components we source from outside the United States. And I think we're going to turn it over to some Q&A. I think we're done from the Medtronic side.
Okay, well, outstanding. Thank you, Noel, Greg, and John for an excellent setup there. So just as we roll into the Q&A here, let me remind the committee, if you would use your hand raise, which Lee, you're already on it, thank you. I will sort of in order that you raise your hand. So with that, Lee, you had your hand up first. Why don't you take us off with the first question?
Thanks, Wally, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. So I've got two questions, and the first relates to the nature of the supply shortages that our first speaker was addressing. Right, as I was listening to you describe them, it seemed that all of the shortages that you noted were what I might loosely describe as episodic reactions to a weather, regulation, policy, or firm-specific shock, right? Which sometimes had pretty big ramifications because this particular site or this particular firm accounted for a pretty large fraction of that particular component. But once the firm or the industry had time to respond to the shock, the shortage went away. And something else might happen, but it would be a different product in a different place. This seems very different from the kinds of shortages we've been thinking about in the context of the pharmaceutical industry, where you've got the same product or the same product group experiencing quality problems that generate a shortage of product of sufficiently high quality, and this persists over time. That doesn't seem to be a feature of the medical device space. I just want to make sure that that is in fact the case, right? And if so, you know, why is it, right, that you don't see these kinds of persistent quality related shortages in medical devices? And then for our speakers from Medtronic, you know, the question here is how you're able to ensure consistent quality when you're dealing with suppliers from developing countries that have limited regulatory institutions and perhaps a different mindset when it comes to product quality, right? Can you talk a little bit about how you work with the supply base in that country to maintain consistent quality standards? Thanks.
Mark, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's very true. They are very episodic, the type of shortages that we're talking about. There are some systemic ones. Sometimes they're design related. The way the technology develops and a certain design has been implemented, and that design ends up a competitor comes out with a design that's better. Then what actually happens, the market shifts fast, and so if it was a shortage type thing, but the competitor came out, because med devices, the product development life cycle is a lot faster than pharma. So we got a new API, 8 to 10 years, right, from development. Typically, if it's sort of like on a, when I worked at the Guidant Boston Sci Pacemaker Group, we would develop a new platform every 3 years. We'd have a new product every 18 months. So you can, pharma doesn't do that. So the products change over very fast if need be. And if there's a systemic, design improvement that's needed, the companies, because of the competitive environment, will create the new products that will eliminate that long-term shortage that may happen in pharma. And also one of the big things about the medical device industry, like the top 12, I looked up the top 12 US manufacturers of med devices, Medtronic's the first, number one, are 40% of the market with approximately, 300 to 400 sites out of the 6,000. So there's a lot of large, there's a few large, a dozen, 20, 30 large, and there's thousands of small, like, 30 person to 100 person companies. And there's very little mid-size, because basically it ends up moving around a lot. So there's very little mid-size. It's not like an equal, like there's not like 1,000 mid-size. There's more like 200 to 300 mid-size, and then the rest of thousands are small size, depending on your definition of small. So that's sort of why the market is very flexible and can change products.
Yeah, let me add a little bit before Noel answers the quality question that you had, Lee, because I think there's an important thing there that you're asking about, particularly the weather phenomenon that happened in Houston. I mean, I got 89 force majeure letters. I'd never had that many in my career. And I came out of the resin industry, by the way. I worked for one of the resin OEMs earlier in my career. And so it was just absolutely unprecedented. And the challenge that we have is there might be a certain specific polypropylene resin that we designed in on. And while there might be an equivalency, if that reactor, that specific reactor that we designed upon, if that specific supplier goes down, we're in trouble, because for our ability to go and get it qualified on a dime just doesn't happen that fast. And so it's very, very challenging when one of these, suppliers goes down for whatever reason. It can really permeate through our supply chain in a much more profound way than I think in other industries, in my opinion.
Very good, John. So Lee, let me answer the question that you have. Let me start by saying that we manage a very high variation from the standpoint of supplier maturity and supplier understanding of quality. So for example, we get semiconductors from Taiwan, very advanced manufacturing processes, but we get components from a niche, very small organization that have a specific technology that we need to acquire to put in our devices. So to answer your question specifically, we have a discipline, a group of people inside the organization that is part of what we call the Supplier Development Department. And between supplier development, supplier quality, we go and work with the suppliers in the US or outside the United States and help them grow and develop and get better from the standpoint of quality requirements and improvements from the standpoint of capacity and capabilities. So for example, we have a methodology that we create in Medtronic that is called first-time quality. So we send our coaches to the supplier, and we coach and train the suppliers if we see areas of opportunity in the supplier. We go and train the suppliers in Lean Sigma methodologies in how to do problem solving. And we not only do the technical work, but also work on the cultural human behavior aspects of developing the supplier by training and teaching the supplier the quality culture that we teach and we ingrain in the organization in Medtronic. So we got a number of things that we do with suppliers outside the United States and the United States to improve quality and outcomes coming from them.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. George.
Thank you, Mark and Noel and Greg and John. So my question has to do with, I guess, your perception of business continuity planning at your companies or in the industry. So after 9/11 at Guidant, we had this massive business continuity push to make sure that we were never going to be dependent on products being flown from Ireland to Minneapolis because we stocked our defibrillator line out because there was no air freight allowed for quite a while. And so at that time, there was an initiative there to make sure that there were dual source suppliers and there was the ability to manufacture the final assembly in the US at a certain percentage of capacity. If I look at for instance, the Medtronic global supply chain and the focus on the unfortunate risk of single sources, which I totally understand, the small companies that make niche products, and a lot of those are sole and single sourced. It seems like it could be considered high risk to things like pandemics or hurricanes or disruptions, tariffs, things like that. Are there business continuity plans in place that you consider these are our top revenue products or our top human life products that we have the ability to make with dual source or manufacture in the US, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, Greg, I'm happy to chime in. And so the answer is yes. I mean, we do that very highly redundant from the manufacturing side of processes. And certainly on we call our top 20 franchise products, we make sure that redundancy is built in, designed in, and through that. I think the challenge is with, as you saw, we have, over 100,000 SKUs. It's just, could I look you in the eyes and say we have perfect redundancy all the way through the entire supply chain globally? And then the answer is no. But we do work on all the major product families. We do put this in. It's kind of an ongoing plan that we have in the company, and we work it very, very actively. And frankly, we also expect our suppliers too, particularly after what we learned in Puerto Rico, to have those types of redundancies within their own network. Now, it may not be designed into that specific product, but they could be quickly added in, and we obviously work with the FDA if those challenges would ever come up.
And they're also there. It's not just about redundancy of production as well. It's also about safety stocks, given different times of the year. It's also about other areas of contingency planning. So think about Puerto Rico and the facilities there. Contingency planning there is how do you have backup, 100% backup power? How do you have backup telecommunications? So it's not necessarily just redundancy, but it's making sure that you have ways of mitigating the specific incidences that you deem to be a risk that may impact you at that location.
Yeah, and then George, just to add to that, at the enterprise level, we have an enterprise risk management committee that is composed of the executive committee that reports to the CEO, and on an ongoing basis, we review risk across the enterprise, and we report that to the board of directors. So there's a comprehensive program on making sure that we address business continuity. And as John mentioned, we do have redundancies for the high risk devices and components.
Yeah, so I mean, as a contract manufacturer, we're just small. We're in one plant here, so our backup is, we got to outsource some of this, but basically, if a tornado hit and destroyed all 3 buildings we're in, then yeah, we're down. So we don't have that as a contract, but Medtronic has other suppliers that they would go to. Now, some of our other customers, like some of this is public domain, so I can talk about it. Like Ethicon J&J, their plant is making the sutures, but they actually built a duplicate for the suture material itself. They had one main plant in Atlanta that was building it. They built another plant like 40 miles away that sits idle to make the suture material because it was a very specialized process. So they end up creating duplicate facilities and not sitting it. And then I have a friend that's at 3M, and 3M talked about this for their PPE lines, that they actually have some surge capacity built in because they always have an event. Anywhere in the world, there's always an event somewhere where more PPE is needed. Like, when Ebola hit in Africa, Fukushima plant in Japan also needed more PPE because of all the nuclear spread. So, a lot of companies build that in. There are some third-party softwares that after 9/11 are now available that help manage that. And so some companies utilize these third-party software suppliers to help manage that. And then if there's an event, they ask the suppliers in that area, did this event affect you? And then they feed that up the supply chain to the different companies that buy into that software. So the industry has looked at some things, but it's totally, it's ad hoc. Each company does it, whatever they need to do.
Yeah, the specific example in Medtronic, I realized that we did not give you one, but if you think about the foundation of Medtronic was on cardiac rhythm management devices. In that particular example, that's one of the biggest business for us. We produce the devices in 3 locations, Puerto Rico, Switzerland, and Singapore. And with those 3 sites, we have full redundancy for that very important line of business.
Okay, thank you all. Matt, you're next up.
So I'll echo Wally's thanks. This has been incredibly helpful for me. And I want to track down one thing that Noel mentioned a moment ago, because I think we've talked a bit now about this sort of specialized niche components of the products that you all make. But there are also, I heard a couple of you talk about some of the sort of common components and the common delivery mechanisms. And there's a set of issues there that I wanted to hear a little more about. And so with a common component, I heard at least 2 problems. One is that you are in competition sometimes for these common components with consumer goods. And if, the Sony PlayStation needs the component and you need the component, the Sony PlayStation is going to win because they're at such larger volume. And I assume this is sort of what's been happening to some extent with automobile manufacturers and computer chips and so on recently, is that specialized manufacturers at relatively low volume lose, when it comes to a common component that goes into much higher volume products. And then the second piece I heard is the sort of common delivery mechanisms that may leave lower volume products out in the cold in a moment where sort of the folks who run these delivery mechanisms are not health professionals. They don't prioritize healthcare goods any more so than they prioritize all their other stuff that they're moving around. And so I see three ways to approach these sort of common problems. And I think you've mentioned all of them, but one of them was particularly intriguing to me. One would be you pay more. So if you're going to pay more than everyone else, you may get prioritized. Two is that you have a regulatory force behind you, so Defense Production Act or some other way in which a regulatory body says, thou shalt prioritize this healthcare use or this healthcare delivery over your other business. And number three, which Noel mentioned, is sort of culture change. And if you will, the healthcare professionalization of organizations, entities that don't normally prioritize healthcare, but in a pandemic, they're willing to pitch in and prioritize healthcare because they see that as their social value, as a social value for them, or as an ethical responsibility. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that third option of sort of professionalization or ethics or the social responsibility argument, and where have you seen that work or where have you seen it fail in terms of encouraging a common goods manufacturer or a common delivery mechanism to choose to leave some money on the table potentially because they have this social responsibility to help the healthcare system right now?
Yeah, man, let me tackle that one, because I think they're actually, all the three questions are intertwined. And let me build on your semiconductor example, because I've been living this now for the last 6 months, where the good news is when we get this in front of the microchips and the microprocessors and the various components and semiconductors in front of their leadership, they get it. I mean, they think, oh my gosh, okay, yeah, for sure, we understand. Our challenge is the medical device industry buys 1/100th of all the semiconductors made in the world. So yeah, you do run that risk of coming up against a PlayStation sort of scenario, although there are different technologies. Unfortunately, we're not competing against PlayStation, so I'll let you sleep a little bit better on that one. But I think the thing that for me that I've learned through this process is that level of transparency to the sub tier, where our contract manufacturers sometimes aren't able to communicate to the chip processor that this is going to a Medtronic or going to a medtech device. And so how do we create that supply chain transparency so we don't have to have these escalation meetings, which I've been involved in many of. I can't tell you how many I've been involved in the last 6 months, to make them aware that this is going into a life-saving device, and there's a challenge there. We're very fortunate our CEO, Jeff Martha, got to speak in front of the administration and raise this up, because again, we're just a small buyer of chips, but critical to many of our devices across the industry. So I think creating that level of transparency and that advocacy, to your point, is the most important thing, because I think people get the ethics of it. They get the fact that this is such a big deal, and I think we just have to continue to work on that really good way of tying all these out back into the med device space, in my opinion.
Yeah, we saw that too. We had a couple scenarios where companies that we were selling to, like a Medtronic or other companies, that they said, if you need any help, we have a letter for the Defense Production Act that you can use this because we're making PPE, or we're making, we were doing some stuff for, some COVID tests. We were making parts for COVID tests. And like, if you need to get this material, you can use this. And so we were able to, we were telling our supply chain, because we buy from distributors that, sell DuPont material, and DuPont makes, plastics for the entire world. And so we were able to get some prioritization. It really we didn't need to use it that much, but they do understand that. And so a lot of our suppliers, are also mixed suppliers that, they're makers of materials, but they also might make some med device themselves. A couple of them were, one division makes the raw material for like the PPE, the non-wovens, and then another division makes them into finished products. So they understand that, and then we were making a subset of those types of parts, or specialized parts. So they understand the supply chain. It would be nice if as a sub-supplier, we could get something like that in this pandemic, that we could have gotten that would have really helped. Either coming down from our customers and feed down. There was no process for that.
Can I ask a follow-up in terms of DPA? Is there something short of DPA that would be useful in the regulatory space? Maybe I'm wrong. I feel like invoking the Defense Production Act is sort of a big deal. And I'm wondering if there's a policy option, a regulatory option of some sort that would just across the board sort of raise the priority of medtech products when there are incipient shortages. But I'm not, this is a vague thought, and I'm wondering if you can help me.
I mean, on shipping, I know for that, if we need to get priority shipping, med devices aren't big. We're not dealing with big things. So a lot of stuff can be air freighted. So, if I need a priority, we'll get our suppliers to air freight rolls of material that usually would go by truck because they need it faster. So we'll pay more and then, talk with the customer because they want it faster. We'll implement that types of scenarios. So then you're getting better service from your 3PLs and, FedExes and UPSs and stuff. So the cost, being able to, do additional costs because they're not, we're not doing really super heavy products and unless you're an MRI machine, but most stuff can be shipped air freight.
So we're not aware of any other process.
So you mentioned the escalation meetings, though. So it sounds like that's kind of what happens if you don't have a formal process in place, that when there's an incipient shortage that you call up and get consideration. Does that usually work? And does it, after the fact, you're already experiencing a shortage, or can you do it in advance of a shortage actually appearing?
That's a great question. I'd have to say I'd say most of the time people know that they're supporting us, and so it's not that big of a deal. It's just when these sub-tier products, especially the ones that have moved offshore, and then people don't understand that it's going into the device. Contract manufacturers, hey, I need 5,000 of these things, and of course they're maybe 10 are for med device and 4,900 are for someone else. So it's just that level of clarity. So when they're asking, it's being designated for us. We have had to intervene through distributors to make sure when we set it up with the OEM that it comes to us, it doesn't get lost in the distribution channel. So there's just some unfortunate handholding that goes on today's fragile global supply chain that I wish it wasn't there, but we have to build that resiliency in to make sure we don't come up short when times get tough with supply.
Okay, thank you. Larry. You're muted, Larry. No, you're still on mute, Larry. We can't hear you. No.
There we go. Okay, sorry. The Medtronic just had such a wonderful growth story. I mean, the patent wall at your headquarters is really just amazing. It really underscores how well you guys have done. You're a leader in virtually every category. But, as I was listening to you talk about the challenges you face, I think about acceleration. I'm just wondering, for the benefit of the committee, how easy is it to accelerate production when there's outsized demand? How easy is it to shift from EMEA to APAC if there's an issue that causes that? What have you learned from what we've been through during the last 18 months, and what's the answer? I mean, ocean containers are a disaster now. Air freight capacity is limited. When do we return to a more normal state? What's changed?
I mean, I'll certainly lead in. I'll let my colleagues chime in too. I think, unfortunately, the first thing you do is you lead with inventory. What Greg said earlier, you have to plan through some contingency planning. What comes some worst case things that occur. I think, the speed and acceleration that you bring up is a great point. I think we're constantly trying to figure that out. I mean, the great example we had was the whole ventilator situation with COVID, where we were making 50 of these, a week, and we had to go up to 1,000 a month. We had to just massively ramp up. And that required a lot of creativity. And we were partnering with General Motors and Tesla to get components scaled up quickly. And so every now and then these crises do show that the industry can respond, but you hate to waste a crisis, but we'd like to figure out, to your point, get a little bit more thoughtful ahead of this thing where we can. And sometimes it's information systems, sometimes it's just government support and insight, and sometimes it's the industry pulling together to work collaboratively on these things. So when a crisis does come up, and let's face it, there's going to be another one, who knows what. We just have to, build in that resiliency as an industry and work in partnership, I think, in a tighter way, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mark, please.
Oh, so the example too, we had to ramp up the emergency use authorization by the FDA. All of a sudden, these products, like a lot of the SARS tests, all this COVID type testing that happened, there was like 30 to 50 different manufacturers all got emergency use authorization. Usually that process would take months to years to get all those authorizations. They came right away. So one of our customers was working on a test, and they basically had a manual process, and we were working on an automation that went like from that. So we had to just all of a sudden, well, let's get this in the line faster, get the raw materials here faster. And, we were making our product first validation runs, and we were shipping those, and they were building those because they met spec into COVID tests, like within the next week. So we ramped up. It was like more than 10x. Same thing you on the ventilators. Just this insane ramp up. A lot more oversight needed. You can't use just standard processes. You got a lot more oversight to get that ramp and then get it back stable at that volumes. But it was very difficult. A lot of dealing with the supply chain that we were, the suppliers of raw material to us and how they were building it. And you really have to go all the way deep in the supply chain to see where's the critical path that's going to hold you from doing a 10x ramp.
I think the other thing that you've got to be very cognizant of is what capacity utilization are you utilizing. If you're at a high level of capacity utilization, you don't have the ability to handle much elasticity around the demand, right? So I think it's made a lot of industries think about where do you operate, right? There tends to be better burden absorption, better cost structure if you're running high utilization. But the reality is you don't have the flexibility to react. So first and foremost for us is capacity within our own facilities. Then you got to have the capacity to be able to create, the opportunity to bring the labor in to be able to resource it. And then it goes back to the supplier base as well to make sure that we have the inputs that we can actually convert and produce the products. And so, Larry, to your question of what have we learned over these last, 18 months is it's kind of gone through cycles as to what's been the impact, So whether your point it's transportation or whether it's raw materials or whether it's labor or whatever, but I think a lot of it starts with capacity and making sure that you're planning at the right level so that you can take into consideration where you may have something that's normal. I doubt any of us would have stood back and said a pandemic's coming, so therefore, but for other normal cycles of hurricanes and things of that nature, that tend to occur frequently, then those are the kind of planning that you do.
Can I follow up on that just a little bit, John and Greg, on the ventilator example that you mentioned, so that you partnered with GM and Tesla to do assembly of ventilators. Was that something that there was any kind of advance agreement in place, or the pandemic hit, the huge demand was anticipated and you went out and recruited them, or they volunteered, or how did that actually come about?
No, I think crises make strange bedfellows, right? And certainly, thinking of automotive companies and SpaceX, being involved, but it was really more on the components, very highly precise engineered, components, 1,500 components in a ventilator. And so, we were forced and to do this in a very rapid way. And so we were basically reaching out into the industry and various consortiums and connections that we have in our networks and help facilitate that. And again, having great product design organizations at Medtronic, great quality people that could be with us step by step and making sure all those things were done, which was immensely helpful. We obviously put one of our different ventilators on open source, to help the pandemic, just to provide a surge, capacity. Because early days of the pandemic, if you all recall, everybody felt if you didn't have a ventilator, you were going to be in trouble if you got COVID. So a lot of lessons learned through that. But yeah, we orchestrated them quick. We put agreements in place. There's always a concern about IP and medtech and like in any industry. So we had to move fast and swiftly. And I think that's the size sometimes, the advantage that a company like Medtronic has, because of the ability of the resources that we have and can put at these challenges when they come up. And that we were very, very advantaged because of that.
So I think that's really admirable. The question I guess I have is, could it be done better for the next time? I mean, is there any opportunity for sort of advance arrangements, that is sort of contingency plans in place that say, we don't know what might be needed, but here's how we would work together if something hit, and you knew that GM, say, was going to be a sort of a surge final assembly partner for you in a future pandemic? Or
it's a great question. I think that the dilemma is as Greg showed, we have over 100,000 SKUs, and thinking, okay, who has the capability to do that component manufacturing for us if something happens, and having the time to canvas the world for those specialty things. And I would add too that in med tech, it is tech, and things are constantly changing and evolving. You look at the pacemakers now that are the size of a pill. I mean, the pill cams now to prevent colonoscopy. Just the advancements in the technology, it's sometimes hard to anticipate who could be that strategic partner that could keep pace with us in this space. So I wish there was an easy answer to that question. It's a great question. It's just very, very difficult to anticipate who could handle those types of things for us and be basically idled, right? We'd be asking engineering time. Hey, we don't know what's going to happen, but in the event, can you be there for us? And a lot of for-profit companies aren't really interested in those discussions, in my experience.
Right, and there's from just to note, the FDA has over 6,000 product codes, so 6,000 different types of products. Which ones are going to be needed? We needed ventilators for this one. Maybe next one is we need IV infusion pumps, or we need whatever. We don't know which device is going to be needed to mitigate.
I mean, clearly, you've made a compelling case that it would be impossible to do this, SKU by SKU. That's out of the question, just given the number and the complexity and the changing technology. But the case I'm thinking of, there's a famous case with Toyota where they had a P-valve plant that burned down, and within 4 days, they were up and running again. Now, they didn't have any contingency plan in place. What they had was a karaitsu of their suppliers, right? So they basically were in a war room with these suppliers, figuring out that problem. They didn't know who would, had the capability to ramp up to produce P-valves before this fire hit, but they knew who to talk to, right? It took minutes to assemble the war room and get the conversation started. So when I would ask the question, John, I was thinking more along the lines of, do you have sort of a selected set of people that you would talk to? Or maybe you did. You said you got into your Rolodex or whatever and started calling. And
but you're right. But it was, for my taste, it was too much informal. I like the formal thinking, Wally. I think that would be better if it was set up, for those kinds of things, and how that could be facilitated would be an interesting concept. Maybe the Academy could explore and think through how that might be facilitated. That would be great. Because a lot of times in our industry, there's competitive concerns, and so sometimes sharing information within our competitors just isn't encouraged. But the things we do with our suppliers, has worked. But formalizing that certainly is a good idea.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks very much, Alistair.
Yeah, one of the things we've heard from drug suppliers is that shortages tend to occur in low margin businesses like generic drug supplies, for example. And as an outsider, you get the impression that was also the case in the recent pandemic. Low margin supplies ran out pretty fast, PPE and so on. Do you have any sense of what the differences are between, say, Medtronic's supplies, which are obviously high value, high margin, and the other types of interventions that are needed that are low margin and lower value, which ran out pretty quickly, and how we could get it in ensuring their supply?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you'd have to almost look by component families. Like we commoditize, metals, the contract manufacturing, molded components, packaging, sterilization. In each of those industries, macro industries, have a different set of dynamics. I think the thing that was maybe not, I know I didn't have time to drain my slide, but in that was a bullet I put about how, unfortunately, while it might be higher margin for suppliers, the volume's so low. So their ability to make massive profitability off this when it's a high mix, low volume scenarios for them is somewhat challenging. But yeah, is there a little bit more resilience? We certainly saw that. I mean, we were very closely monitoring the financial health of our supply base and set up programs to pay them immediately. We set up a dynamic discounting program. So we wanted to make sure none of them got in trouble during the pandemic. And I'll tell you, in full honesty, we had a handful of them, but it was very small, and I thought it was going to be much worse. And in fact, I know Noel's probably smiling because I was warning everybody, like, get ready, we're going to have some financial problems. But fortunately, because of maybe some of their resiliency financially, it wasn't as bad as we had anticipated. But it's hard to answer that specifically because you have to look at all the different macro industries.
What we do is we organize by commodity. So John has commodity leaders. And the dynamic tend to be similar in metals, in plastics, in sterilization houses. So that's the way that he managed. But the recipe has to be tailored to that commodity. In terms of the recipe, in terms of what we do, has to be tailored to that commodity.
Right, and one of the questions you were talking about is low margin material. So is it the raw material or the finished low margin material? So there were some national stockpiles for PPE, but you have to. Their medical devices are sterilized. They have a shelf life that's a lot shorter than the actual material itself, based on the sterilizations. So you have to refresh those all the time. And there's not a process for, I don't think, of the national stockpile, how that is set up today, how that was done, because that national stockpile was not there really as needed, as fully staffed. I think my friend at 3M on the PPE side said, no, it got drained before the US really needed it. So
It's helpful.
Sad but true. Thank you. Louis.
So we have glancingly discussed this, and in fact, it just came up in response to the last question. But one of the oft observed vulnerabilities of the supply chain now is its leanness, its just-in-time aspect. And having listened to your incredibly educational presentations, I can see three main reasons why warehousing, stockpiling, so forth, isn't a universal solution for the medical device industry. And the three categories I would posit are expiration, which is in connection with sterilization in some instances, as you just mentioned, customization, which means that oftentimes we're talking about low volume, and innovation, which means that a lot of times if you stockpile or warehouse products, they'll be obsolete by the time you want to use them. But all that being said, the news reports are suggesting that corporate America as a whole has gone lean, really stripped down their inventories. And are there places in the medical device supply chain where arguably the calculation could be changed in terms of the amount of warehousing that's done for either components or supplies that aren't subject to the three limitations I mentioned, like class 1 device, sutures, adhesives, things like that. Those seem like things that, there might be sterilization issues, but just in general, like is there room for making the supply chain less lean in the medical device industry?
There's certainly areas where you could, typically when you have the volatility around demand, it tends you to put safety stock in to be able to, for raw materials, to be able to have them in the supply chain, to have them ready because of the volatility that exists. I would say the 3 points that you raise are, spot on as far as the challenge for us is making sure that we can call the demand. That's probably one of the biggest factors that influences the overall. And if you have a very standard set demand and you know what that demand is going to be consistently, it's easier to plan for unless you have volatility. And the example that we used earlier around the ventilators, was a 500-fold increase, in a really, really short period of time. So, John, there are certainly areas, and I'd say it's fair to say that we, as an example, on some of the items, given the extent of the supply chain and the cycle time, where we have items, maybe they come out of Asia that get assembled in Mexico. We actually increased our stock on our raw materials and packaging materials because of the volatility and the concern of the breaking of the supply chain. With the point that was made earlier about the cargo ships being taking longer to get here, having to use alternative sources. But John, anything you'd add?
Yeah, no, Greg, you're right, and it's a great question, Louis. I think the inventory does become the de facto default all the time, unfortunately, and it's at least in medtech. And I know other industries are leaning out, and we are working hard to be as lean as we possibly can. We just tend to make sure, because it's setting up the resiliencies there. I get probably, maybe at least monthly or every other month, a supplier deciding they want to get out of medtech. Quality's too high, not enough volume. And so we do a lot of last time buys, and we have strategic warehouses around the country where we keep last time buy materials, and we'll buy up sometimes 8-10 years worth of material because they're exiting the business. And so that is a different, unique thing than the other industries I worked in, where it was not that those challenges that we face in the industry. And so unfortunately, it's just those things we have to plan for in the nature that what we do. And I think information sharing, where those last time buys can maybe be shared as an industry, or industry goes together and buys that where it's possible. Again, a lot of our stuff's unique, but those are ideas that we can obviously further explore and pursue.
Yeah. So Louis, I'm probably not going to go around and say let's be less lean, but I think that we can be more responsive to the changes in demand. I give you an example because I want to make sure that you understand that we do make hard decisions and become less lean when we see risk to the organization. I used to run a manufacturing facility in Medtronic where I was not very proud of this, but it was required. I had 25% of my inventory sitting in a warehouse because it was a last time buy. That's a very high number for a manufacturing facility, but I have to do it so I can mitigate risk. And I was not very lean, I can tell you that. So we do it, but we manage risk component by component.
Just one quick follow-up. Would you people who have long experience in the med tech industry say that compared to 20 years ago, the industry is leaner today than it was 20 years ago, as is the case with, for example, the automotive industry?
I would say the answer is no, and the reason why is there's more products than there ever have been before 20 years ago. And so as you look at the immensity of it, now have we gotten smarter and used supply chain demand planning? Absolutely. We use integrated business planning at Medtronic, as do many of our competitors, I'm sure, S&OP processes. So we're applying best practices from other industries, but it just the complexity and the growing size of the SKUs and SKU proliferation to meet all the sizes and shapes of the human beings around the world adds a pretty big layer of complexity.
Let me explain. Let me give you a specific example on that so you understand what he's talking about. In many industry, when you have a new device and you put it in the market, you can immediately remove the predicate device from the market. Not immediately, but pretty quick. In the medtech industry, that is not the case. We still produce 3 generations of defibrillators back from the one that we are marketing as the brand new generation. And it's part of how the commercial world, the commercial situation happened. It's part of how buying channels work. It's part of the standard of care in many hospitals. So when that happened to you, you have to maintain inventory. You need to maintain supply chain of 4 generations of defibrillators so you can supply the market.
Right, yeah, because regulatory is different. And I can start one Baxter. I talked to somebody at Baxter. They're still making glass IV bottles for Vietnam because they haven't gone to plastic. This is 1960s technology. They haven't upgraded.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's what countries want, what the customers want.
Well, it's also the physicians. The physicians are trained differently, and some doctors like the old school way. I mean, for example, spinal surgery, depending on the doctor, some go to the stomach, some go to the side, some go to the back. So we have to have all different kinds of tools and apparatuses to make sure we're satisfying the physician's needs so they take care of the patient. So there just is a different level of complexity here that we see versus other industries that I've worked in the past.
Yeah, the only thing I think about lean is I think the industry has changed as more contract manufacturers, so more flexibility there than there used to be. Like back in the 90s, in the Twin Cities, there was separate manufacturers of components, and now they've grouped together, and now there's like a dozen different companies that basically do contract manufacturing here, and they're not just specialized. So they have a lot more flexibility, each one of them, versus back in the 90s that didn't exist.
So Lewis was putting his finger on a fundamental issue that comes up a lot in this supply chain resiliency discussion, which is that the sort of firm level of investment in business continuity and resilience is going to be different than, say, the socially optimal level, right? You guys don't necessarily want to invest in the 500-year flood, right? To put in enough capacity or inventory to protect against such an unlikely event is going to make you uncompetitive, right? What we've heard on the pharma side is that when you have high margin, say branded drugs, it's in the interest of the producer to build in quite a lot of protections to make sure that, that business is continuous. When we get over to the generics or really low margin products, the companies don't have that incentive. And when we look at routine shortages, that's where they all happen, right? Is exactly the place where industry doesn't have that. Do you see similar things here? Because John, you mentioned that some of your customers don't pay for quality at the level that you're providing, or do they not pay for the same kind of business continuity? Are you
mean suppliers or customers?
Customers. I'm talking about customers in this case.
I think one thing, Wally, I'd just say before you answer that question is, I think the point of it is you want to be able to service the demand, right? Whatever that demand is. You got to be careful about building inventory because you have shelf life on the product. So there's sometimes a strong correlation. If you overproduce, you end up discarding products on the back end. And so you really don't create any benefit because you're discarding the products. So I think that's the part for us is why we think about, we try to get so much better at the integrated business planning so we get better accuracy of what we produce, and we make sure that we stop that's really relevant. Because if we don't, and then we may have made it, we feel good that it's an inventory, but it's not going to be able to be used because it's going to be out of its lifespan.
But isn't supply continuity or resiliency isn't necessarily about inventory. For instance, you mentioned for one of your products you have 3 producers.
Yeah, it's not. But I'm sorry, but an example of where the question was, are we lean out too much? The answer is no. That's the downside of it, right? So there are trade-offs in some of these decisions. So yes, in a lot of cases, you're better to have redundant capacity, or yes, you're better off to have raw material safety stock versus finished goods.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, Rob, we've been waiting for a while. The floor is yours.
No rush. Thanks, Wally. Good to see you folks. I'd like to probe a little bit on the transparency issue. You may have noticed the report that just came out from the administration calling for pretty radical transparency of supply chain as a standard. And I think we've heard, particularly on the pharma side, that it's about as opaque as you can get. And that is when you're buying a product, if you're a hospital or a health system, or you're thinking about it as a consumer, you can't find out where the stuff came from. Still remember Senator Mikulski dumping her generic drugs out on the table in front of me when I was FDA commissioner and saying they were a different color every month, so she couldn't figure out which ones to take without an extensive chart to compare one to the other. What's the argument? It would seem like where we're striving for a market of information symmetry between the buyer and the provider. What is there an argument against making the supply chain publicly available and transparent?
I guess, I like Noel to chime in here, but I guess it would depend on the level of detail that's being provided. When you think about all the components that go into a med tech device, giving that transparency to consumer might just require so much documentation and paperwork, and would people actually read it and benefit from it? Would be the question. I think for me, the transparency that I talk about is the information sharing and the knowledge of where that is and where the device has been. Is it quality approved and everything? So it creates more of an industry, transparency versus something to the consumer. Because in the day, the doctor's putting this in, you're relying on trust of your doctor to administer the procedure for the therapy that you need. And so I think it's a little bit different than pharma. Again, I'm not a pharma expert, but I think the transparency I seek is just more the information flow within the industry to make that better and more efficient.
I want to push back a little bit. I mean, I'm a cardiologist, so I've had a little experience. The doctors generally don't know. And they can't find out. And we've heard from purchasers for health systems and hospitals that they can't find out either. What the chain of lateraling, these different constituents. And, and I'd agree, we've heard a lot more about it on the pharma side, and I'm pretty familiar with the issues there, and they are substantial because of the sources often are very difficult to audit, for example, by the FDA. So what, other than the fact that it might be complicated and hard for people to understand, I guess I heard your other argument being the old least burdensome argument we always hear from the industry, which is understandable. Is there anything more to it than that?
Well, Rob, maybe can I ask the question, or maybe have you reframe the question? What specific problem were we trying to solve? Just getting the consumer more knowledgeable of where all the components in the med device have come from?
Let's take the word consumer broadly, meaning it could be the consumer in the sense of an individual, but more likely the person purchasing the product wanting to know what the source of the product was in a chain of supply that the seller knows about, but the people buying really can't figure out. Are you saying that doesn't matter, or they shouldn't worry about it?
I'm trying to understand what so if something you're saying, we would want to provide all the, if you will, list of ingredients, a list of components of where they're coming from. Is that what you're saying? So I'm clear?
Yeah.
And
maybe also, it seemed to be from the report from the administration, and certainly something we've discussed on this committee. I mean, the other purpose would be a public assessment of whether the industry is too lean or has adequate resilience. In the case of anticipated probabilistic problems.
I guess, providing that information by component, by location. I guess it's just, I'm struggling to answer you because I just haven't been asked that before in terms of providing that, because no one's kind of sought that. But I guess where you're going with is that information is important to understand the resiliency, because all those questions will be answered as providing that information. Is that where you're going with it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Rob, I don't think that there's a transparency problem. We do have that information, and if it's required and it add value, I don't see a problem. We do provide the final manufacturing location in our medical devices right now, but we don't have available to customers from where every single component arrive.
Yeah, so the high level, so the FDA, like if products sold in the US, the FDA's registration on med devices sets up saying, here's the product code, and here's the manufacturers that make that product code, and this is what they do. They're the specification developer, they're the manufacturer, they're the contract manufacturer, they're the sterilizer, they're the distributor. So the FDA has that information on the type of manufacturer for that part. So you know that these are the ones. Now the question, this specific one, if there's 5 sterilizers, which sterilizer sterilize this part? That's not on. If you have resiliency in the supply chain, I can sterilize with 2 different sterilizers. Med device companies don't put on which sterilizer. They say it's been sterilized, and their history records have that data. there's never been a request for asking like which one, who made it, who did all these different steps in the manufacturing process, because there can be everything can be built in one plant, or everything can be built in 25 different plants, depending on the complexity of the component. So it just gets, got to go blockchain here and get everything history in it. So I don't know. I don't think we're.
I don't think it's an issue of transparency. Just to be clear, I don't think it's an issue of transparency. If the information is requested, we can provide it. We have it available.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you guys don't think it would be that useful. And maybe it's very different in the device industry from the drug industry, where I'm pretty confident it's really important to have better information. And we've heard it pretty clearly from purchasers. So it's something to try to track down about. If you requested it, how could you make it, would it really be useful to have?
Yeah, I know like drugs have a whole thing on counterfeit drugs, and they're doing all these, specialized serialization and stuff like that for handling, pharma. Med device doesn't have as big of an issue on counterfeit. I've seen counterfeit devices, but it's typically not as, I haven't seen it as big of a deal. I don't know if you guys in Medtronic seen a lot of counterfeit device products come back. I remember one company, we had some stuff come back from China. I was like, that was counterfeit, rare.
While I have the floor, Wally, can I ask one other question?
Yeah, fire away around.
I mean, if you got, I don't think there's any disputing that a lot of people were injured by the broad category of devices not being available at the right time, at the right place during the pandemic. I guess the question is, and having been on the receiving end of a lot of this and working with a lot of people on the receiving end, there were just massive failures of logistics of getting the right things manufactured and getting them to the right people. You guys are the experts at how the supply chain works. What would what comes to mind for you that you wish could be done better from a public policy, not the point of view of your own company, but that would prevent, the massive numbers of people who are harmed by not having access to, devices ranging from ventilators to PPE?
Well, I think in the nature of the answer, I would say is, I don't think unless AI advances, we figure out other ways, the ability to forecast the demand is going to be, I would imagine, very difficult, depending on what's going to occur. The question is, how do you make supply easier? And how do you find a way to respond better in a way? I mean, if anybody could have predicted the pandemic and understand the demand, then I'm sure, on all industries, because we see it across every industry, they would have had the ability to think about building up the supply that was needed for the demand at the time. The reality is that's not everyday event of the supply and demand in a supply chain. So I think short of us being able to figure out that demand's going to occur, we've got to figure out ways policy-wise to make it easier to be able to respond. And I think that's, that is in a nutshell, because the reality is, you've heard some really difficult things about this industry. And the reason you can't get things qualified quickly, you can't make decisions quickly in certain areas because it's not the nature of the business and how it's operated. So finding ways to reduce the friction and finding ways to help things move faster, I think is going to be a key part of it.
Oh, I think one of the things that I mentioned is standardization of information. So there are standards out there. MedDevice has, the FDA has 1,500 consensus standards that we use in the industry. And a lot of it's very specific. This is how you, test this, how do you test a connector block on a pacemaker? How do you, do a pull test on a pouch? Those standards are out there. Could be product standards, and the EU is going that way on some of this product standards. So if you had a product standard that said for the simple stuff that doesn't change, like gloves, nitrile gloves, very straightforward. Yeah, and the main manufacturer is in Malaysia, right? So how do you get that? So if you created a standard saying, this is how you make nitrile gloves, that the FDA, if you make it this way and provide these documents as part of the standard, you can make nitrile gloves, and you could turn that on really fast because it's documented, open source, because it's low end. It's not really, it's commodity type PPE. If you had a standard that the FDA agreed upon, that kind of thing would drive that. All of a sudden, people would just start, if the demand was there, the price goes up, and then people would jump into it. that's where, you get more manufacturers saying, well, my demand dried totally up, I can switch over. There's I know a bunch of people that, started making masks, cloth masks, because their standard business went away. And it's like, we're just going to start sewing this instead of making, shirts. We're going to make masks. And they just converted because that was really simple. And the FDA said anybody can make masks. So they threw away any rules on masks. So if you had a standards out there on certain products, I think that would allow some flexibility, especially on the low and commodity stuff. Higher end ventilators and other specialty things, that'd be really tough. That change all the time.
Thanks, Mark. Really interesting idea. All right, we're running up against time, so let's get to our last couple of questions here. Lee.
Yeah, well, this is a big question. We only have a limited amount of time, but I'd appreciate it if our guests could take a stab at it. One of the public policy debates raging in the aftermath of the pandemic is the idea that we can make supply chains safer and more reliable by onshoring or reshoring significant chunks of it. I'd welcome your comments on that, whether you disagree or agree with it. Yeah, I'd appreciate a comment. Of course, we have to, this is a big question. We have to keep it brief, but there it is.
I think the challenge and the question then would be, hopefully to be incentive based, and we find ways to be able to do it in a competitive way and not in a punitive way. Because I think, unfortunately, now, if you look at it, there's a lot of negatives with producing some of these items domestically. And that's the reason why the supply chains are so global in a lot of areas. So I hope as we think about it, it is more from a standpoint of making ourselves more competitive and a better place to attract the manufacturers and actually be prepared to produce here, versus a punitive situation of forcing, more inhibiting factors that would create more issues with people being able to be competitive.
Right. And one of the things too is the market isn't just the U.S. anymore. It's the rest of the world. I mean, everybody needs this PPE and everything else. And so you have distributed supply chain because you're selling this stuff all over the world. So if you want to prioritize in the U.S., you can say built in the U.S. has to stay in the U.S. You can do that. But my friend at 3M said, if we didn't sell to the countries that some of these things were made in, the country could nationalize that business and take it away. So you can't just say, oh, I'm going to build all this stuff in China and send it to the U.S. for the pandemic. China's going to say, no, you're making it here. It's going to stay here too. So, worldwide, you got to be able to, be flexible. But I think, like I said, can we make U.S. manufacturers competitive enough so it makes sense to build it here in the U.S.? We've pulled business, some of our customers pull business from China to us because it was cheaper, because we put more automation into the process and they were doing more hand labor in China. So we can make it cheaper but we had to develop new technologies, a lot more capital up front, but it worked. So it can be done.
And I think you see from our supply chain, we have a very global supply chain. We are supplied, we manufacture, we have contract manufacturers, we service a lot of market. And a lot of the innovation in the IP comes internationally as well. So we just need to think all of that in consideration as well, because there are implications to our actions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're almost on time. Craig, you, I think, are going to take us home.
Okay. John, I have to say, I liked your idea about formalizing a pre-planning process that brings together the people who might be players for a particular threat scenario and establish some dialogue ahead of time about, if we have this kind of a threat, here's the kinds of tools we're going to need, and you folks are the people who would have to have the war room in that case. I wanted to also pick up on what Rob said, which I think ties into what you said, John, and that is the primary concern is there's a consumer concern, but I came from the responder environment. And one of my concerns was the inability to anticipate where we were going to have goals unmet because of lapses in the supply chain. Now, Medtronic has a wonderful risk management program, and Neil, I loved your description and discussion of that, but not everybody has that kind of risk management program. And one of our members has brought that to the table numerous times. And so part of what we're thinking of here with the transparency is what are the critical pathways that are extremely vulnerable that one might need to anticipate for various threat scenarios. And that ties in, John, with your idea that if you had these preliminary discussions in a more formal way of engaging the industry in thinking through those kind of problems, that would be very helpful. But that's predicated on some transparency of raw material vulnerabilities. In the drug world, it's API vulnerabilities, et cetera. And not everybody's going to be a Medtronic and have the scope and the quality of the risk management program that you all invest. And in that sense, having that pre-planning group would be an educative moment for people who don't necessarily have that process in play, and they can be mentored by those who have that process. But a lot of that is dependent on transparency and the ability then to anticipate, here's where our vulnerabilities are going to be, and here's where we need to think about how we would anticipate fill in the gap should that vulnerability actually come to pass. And to me, that's why I argue for transparency of information. But I think it's not a regulatory thing. I get concerned about regulation, particularly in an emergency. I happen to know a major company that's now being beat up severely because they stepped up, and in 30 days, we're going to try and produce vaccines for 2 different companies simultaneously. And suddenly the regulatory world became much more demanding of them than they were when they initially asked them to step up and do the work. And so you're right that the regulatory world is a different world than the planning and anticipating for a response and doing that effectively and efficiently. So I appreciate all the things that you all have brought to the table today, and you've enriched our discussion, I think, pretty immeasurably by bringing the stuff you brought today. And I appreciate it. Thank you.
I echo that, and I know that the rest of the committee does as well. Thank you so much for being so candid and thoughtful with your thoughts here. So I hope that you will remain available for individual discussions, with members of the committee, because we may come back to you for some clarification. But as it is, this is really helpful, and thank you so much for doing this.
All right, very good. Thank you for inviting us. Have a good day.
Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Appreciate the time to be able to chat with you guys.
All right, everyone. We are slated for a break. We are going to pause for 15 minutes, and then we will come back at 4:15 and resume and start talking about cost of onshoring. Okay, so everybody take a quick break, recharge, and we'll see you in a few.
We changed Zoom formats to
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move to the second part of our open session, in which we are going to talk with Phil Ellis about his work on the commissioned economic analysis that he's been working on. And so let's start, Phil, with your presentation, and then we'll roll into Q&A there. Okay.
Sure, very good. Thank you, Wally. I just have a few slides to go through, and just to, I guess, introduce myself to the committee. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you for the opportunity to help serve the panel in its mission, which is vitally important. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an economist. I got my PhD at MIT in the 1990s. Worked primarily for the Congressional Budget Office in my career, doing cost estimates for things like the Medicare drug benefit, the Affordable Care Act, and so forth. I've been operating as an independent consultant for about the last 3 years. So just quickly, if we can go to the next slide, just to restate what you may know already, my objective is to provide the committee with useful information about the economic trade-offs involved in some of the choices that you're going to have to make if you're going to make policy recommendations. You're considering onshoring. So how much more expensive would it be to onshore production of PPE or other medical supplies compared to the current production locations? And are there cases where, some production can't be onshored, or is there some sort of as someone put it, is there some unobtainium in the process that would be, some raw materials or other things that are just too difficult to bring onshore? The next slide, please. And to help focus that analysis, since there's a lot one could do under that broad rubric, at the urging of Wally and Lisa, I focused initially on production of N95 masks and to focus on a sort of an example of PPE and a generic chemotherapy drug called, I believe called vincristine. Which has had some supply problems in the recent past. And, I think those are reasonable examples of sort of what I sort of consider two broad categories. It's a continuum, obviously, but there's sort of two broad categories. There are things that become, like PPE that become in extremely high demand and perhaps limited supply during a crisis. And then there are some more, ongoing or routine problems as evident in the case of some generic drugs. And there may well be different optimal solutions for different ones. At some point, I was focusing at first on the question of onshoring, but obviously then there's a continuum of options there, stockpiling, creating surge capacity, and so forth that we can expand the analysis to, but you got to start somewhere. Just to, I guess, lay my cards on the table, I'm guessing, or at least my going in presumption is that onshoring is probably the most expensive option. There's a reason things aren't made onshore anymore, mostly because it's cheaper not to do that. So then it's important to look at sort of that whole continuum. So next slide, please. It has, however, been, at least so far, but I've got some breaking news, I guess, in the last sort of 24 hours. It's the data so far on this that has been the unobtainium itself. I've been trying to reach out to various people, contacts, through the committee and folks I know on my own, to get information about, any information whatsoever about the costs of any of these. How much more expensive is it to make an N95 mask in the US versus China? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's been very challenging, I'm sorry to say. I wish I had a little bit more progress to report on that front. Any suggestions from the committee about, people to talk to, sources of data would be great. I dealt with this kind of problem all the time when I was at CBO. We often had to estimate things like, what would a Medicare drug benefit cost when there was no such thing as standalone drug coverage for Medicare beneficiaries? So I don't need a lot of data, but as Archimedes said, give me about a place to stand and a lever long enough and I can move the earth. Well, I don't have either of those quite yet. I guess to jump to the breaking news. So as perhaps many of you are, I've been reading through the report that was released by the Biden administration yesterday on various issues in the supply chain, not just medical. And found a very interesting sentence about having to do with shortages of generic drugs. So if you don't have it in front of you or haven't committed it to memory, I will read this to you. It's on the bottom of page 223 of the report, speaking of the issue of, so just as background, as some of you know, but maybe not all of you, I think the studies that have looked at shortages in the area of generic drugs have found that most of them, maybe 70%, involve what are called sterile injectable drugs, which are used by hospitals often in things like chemotherapy and other applications. So that's where the problem seems to be. And according to the Biden administration's report, of note, the problem of sterile injectable drugs, is not necessarily an issue of foreign manufacturing, because much of the sterile injectable manufacturing is located in the United States due to the high cost of transporting liquids that often require climate control. So, I mean, much of is not very specific, but it certainly seems like that I would take that as, at least some evidence that it's certainly economically viable to make sterile injectable drugs in the US, and that it occurs kind of on a regular basis. Onshoring may be moot. I mean, certainly one can have, supply disruptions for, with domestically produced products for sure. Power outages, hacking the, security software, you name it, but at least initially, and this is just one sentence in one report, but presumably it's been fact checked. Maybe this problem of sterile injectable drugs is, not one that onshoring could address. The other actually very useful data point in the report is, according to one analysis that's at least a decade old, producing active pharmaceutical ingredients in India, APIs, is, according to one estimate, 30 or 40% cheaper than doing it in the US. Flip the calculation, that means it's, 50% or so more expensive to build it in the US than it would be than it is in India. So at least that's something. We've got maybe a bounding on that problem. It's not so obvious to me that APIs are the issue, but I'll keep digging. On the issue of PPE, Lisa and I had a very good talk with General David Sanford, who has taken over as essentially the kind of HHS coordinator. He's from the Defense Logistics Agency, and obviously an expert on logistics and things of that nature that you need in an army. And talked to him and another gentleman from DOD about N95 masks, because I found out, so at some point in August roughly of last year, the Defense Department announced that it had established contracts to purchase as many as 1 billion N95 masks a year from domestic sources. Estimates vary on how many N95 masks we used in the pandemic, but 1 billion is a lot. And based on my discussions with them, those contracts are in place. Onshoring has happened. I don't know, I didn't get a full picture of how deep into the process the onshoring goes, if they're getting raw materials still from overseas or not. But and Lisa can disagree with me, she was on the same call. Frankly, it seems to me that the horse is out of the barn on onshoring of PPE. The main concern they raised, and this is a very valid one, and I think one that Wally and I had discussed before, is can you keep it? Sure, it exists now, but according to these gentlemen, some 3M and some other companies are laying people off already because they don't have a market for all this PPE capacity that they have. And so it's going to be important, and I guess we can go to the next slide, to start thinking about really what incentives need to be put in place to maintain or either create or maintain a more reliable supply. And we got into a little bit of this on the chat. So I'm an economist. Everything to me, the incentives and information are the two most important things. But of the two, incentives are key. Information is useful, incentives are key. So this discussion we've had about finding out more about where products are made, that wouldn't hurt. But by itself, I personally, my opinion, based on my analysis of this, is that's not going to do very much unless people have incentives to act on that. And they haven't really shown that they do by past behavior, because we've had this sort of series of shortages. And to an economist, I think it's always suspect that, you know, shortages don't last. Price goes up, people enter, shortages go away. So shortages that keep happening, something else is going on. Again, my opinion. You know, but I think as the slides say, you know, if hospitals and purchasers simply want to buy the cheapest product, and that's what they've shown that they want to do in the past for various reasons, you know, strong pressure control costs, whatever, they're going to start buying from China again at some point. You know, just like we're sick of taking our shoes off just because one guy tried to sneak a shoe bomb on a plane 15 years ago. You know, eventually we're going to get sort of pandemic fatigue on that. You know, so I think it's important to consider those incentives, and it's important to consider the trade-offs there. You know, subsidies, penalties, you know, incentives can take the form of carrots or sticks, regulations, but you always have to be careful about the sort of hidden costs of regulations. You can have a Buy American requirement, but that's going to impose costs on the system that somebody's going to bear. So I'll get off my soapbox now. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm a bit of a blunt guy, so I speak bluntly, and if you want to speak bluntly back to me, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Phil. That sets us up. All right, and so now time for us to talk about you know, what this means for us, and what else, you know, you might look at in your analysis. So let me just ask you a question that came from what you said. I was reading the EO report yesterday, and I noticed that they made some comparison that labor rates might be as much as 10 times higher in the US than they are, say, in India or China.
Right.
Now that's a big number.
Right.
On the other hand, you know, if you moved production to the US, you could presumably take out the
Yes.
bunch of that labor by automating. And obviously, if you reduce it by 90%, well, then parity, right? Because it would just basically cancel out. I guess I'm wondering, is that number at all achievable when we talk about some of these advanced manufacturing techniques and so forth that we have? And I have some personal experience with this. I have a friend who basically moved his plant from China back to the US, and he saved money. He basically automated. He doesn't employ very many people in the US, but it basically turned out that when you started looking at the complexity of managing this supply chain, now this was for entirely the US market. He was producing in China for the US. It became feasible. It wasn't in the 90s. By the 2000s, it was feasible to be here.
Among other things, you save on some transportation costs, so you don't have to totally, you know, achieve parity on labor and capital. So you know, like I said, we're starting to unearth. You know, we've done the digging, and we're kind of getting the first few, you know, bones or whatever in the archaeological dig here. So for APIs, you know, the evidence that's somewhat old and therefore maybe an overestimate is that production in India is 30 or 40% cheaper than it is here. You know, and again, sort of, you know, so 50% more to bring it back. And actually, I think I forgot to mention in just the conversation earlier today with General Sanford, that his indication was, I asked him how much more are the N95 masks costing to produce here than in China? He said 20%. So yes, I think, you know, I mean, not surprisingly, when labor is more expensive, you find means of production that use less labor. And so that's been done. And so there is some, you know, based on 2 data points, and, you know, some logic. I mean, if it really was cheaper across the board, right, this would all happen all by itself, right? You wouldn't have to do anything. You know, and I'm sure it happens some, right? There's some production of N95 masks in the US today. There's probably some production of most of this stuff, you know, in the US. And like I said, with sterile injectables, it looks like that's entirely viable, I guess, especially because of the transportation costs are very high. So so that's, so short answer, yes, you know, longer answer, yeah, we have, you know, we you know, it's probably, you know, 20 to 50% more expensive to make it here, you know, which is a real, you know, that's real money, but it's not 2 or 3 times more expensive. You know, so it's reasonable. Now, again, you know, I had, this is sort of breaking news. I hadn't totally absorbed it myself. I don't know that it's that useful for me to continue focusing on onshoring, particularly PPE, if it's basically kind of happened already. I mean, I guess, like I said, to some extent, if you still need to then back out, okay, well, it's working now, but we need to put in a system of subsidies or penalties or something to keep it happening in the future, so that, I don't know, Medicare pays more to hospitals that, you know, can you know, certify that they have a 90-day supply of everything, and secure contracts that, you know, guarantee they're going to have, I mean, as we said in the chat, you know, I feel like a lot of this is solvable through creative contracting, right? You just make your problem your supplier's problem, and they figure out how to solve it, right? I don't need to know where, you know, when I walk into Walmart or I buy a Ford car, I don't really know where they got their stuff. I don't know how they make their windows and so forth. I don't really care as long as the car's there when I want it. So, you know, so Ford has an incentive to solve that problem.
Well, so if we back up and just say, let's just talk about economics a little bit more broadly, right? Right, as opposed to this just onshoring. We noticed that when we asked the question of the Medtronics people, you know, how would onshoring, their shackles kind of went up a little bit, and they said, you know, don't force us to do this. You're going to make us uncompetitive, right?
Right.
Now, I mean, but there are other ways you could do that, right? I mean, tariffs, for instance, you could throw tariffs on, you know, internationally sourced products, and suddenly, you know, it becomes viable to produce it here. Now that imposes an economic penalty on the buyer of the customers for that product. But who said this is free, right? If what we're basically saying is that society wants to pay for protection for the 500-year flood, and industry does not find that to be a viable thing to invest in for their own profit maximization, then somebody's going to pay for it somehow, right? One way to do that is just impose the price on everybody via tariffs, and then let the, you know, the producers that for whom the advantage of outsourcing globally isn't large enough, you know, to offset that differential imposed by the tariff, and done. And everybody pays higher prices, right?
Right.
I mean, you could also subsidize there, like you said, there's carrots and sticks. But so I guess a question that I have for the committee to think about here is, you know, should we be framing this economic question more broadly? Are there other questions that we could ask here to address the question?
You can take my slides down. We can go back to.
Right. Anyway, so because the goal here is that we were charged, and in the charge specifically, they talked about onshoring, you know, basically, you know, creating domestic capacity and so forth. Now, maybe that makes sense in some situations, but clearly we wouldn't want to propose recommendations to force onshoring in situations where you're imposing a much higher cost than the value you're getting from it. So how do we get from point A to point B, which is recommendations that make for a sensible economic recommendation for how to build resiliency into it? And I'll stop talking with that and go to our people. Louis, you had your hand up first. What do you?
Yeah, hi, Phil. Thank you very much. Do you have the recommendations from yesterday with you?
The report? Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to call your attention.
It kind of struck me as pretty weak tea, to be honest, but.
Well, if I could just call your attention to page 240, and I have a question about it.
Okay. I hadn't gotten that far. I hadn't gotten that far in my reading, but I'll go with it, and I'll do my best.
It's not a long sentence. So, so we've been talking a lot about transparency, and the report goes through a fair amount of a discussion of the need for transparency, but that description of the need for transparency, which is, by the way, on pages 235 to 236, focuses on FDA's need for transparency so that they can act as a government entity. One of the issues we've been wrestling with is, should transparency extend beyond HHS, and should it be a more radical transparency that that reaches customers and producers and so forth, journalists, whatever. And they say here that policies should seek to provide increased transparency to distributors and purchasers of the sources of drug manufacturing and the quality of the facilities that make them. And here's the key sentence. Greater transparency will incentivize distributors and purchasers to shift to more resilient sources of supply. And then the next sentence is, policy should also establish mechanisms to reward supply chain resilience. Well, you know, that's what we were just talking about. But as an economist, I'm wondering what your reaction to that middle sentence is.
Yeah, well, to some extent, you know, reports are by committees. You know, it's like a horse designed by a committee as a camel. Yeah, I think the last sentence sort of weakens the previous sentence, which is yes, I'm very sympathetic to the view that policies, whatever the last thing you said was, there need to be, you know, new incentives for this. I think information can be useful. You know, it doesn't hurt to have, you know, a gold star to some extent, if you believe, you know, in the people who are putting the gold star on. But if there's not a willingness to pay, and again, I see a lot of evidence that by revealed preference, there's not a willingness to pay more for quality. That's not, you know, information, you know, it's like you can get farther with a kind word and a gun than with a kind word alone. Information is the kind words, incentives are the gun, if I can be sort of characteristically blunt. You know, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to have more information about the production process. Does the government have to do it? I don't know, right? I think in an earlier discussion we raised, you know, cars are complex products. It's hard to assess the safety of a car just by looking at it. The government provides some car crash test ratings. In my personal experience, they're not that useful because there are a bunch of different ratings, and I don't know, you know, you have to kind of combine themselves in your head or something. The Insurance Institute for Highway Safety provides some very useful ratings because the insurance industry cares about people having safe cars. You know, J.D. Power arises to provide quality awards to good car makers and to other companies. You know, this will happen again if there's a willingness to pay. And again, if there's a market breakdown, and I know Aaron and I have maybe had a little difference of opinion here. Reasonable people can disagree, that's for sure. But if there were financial incentives for hospitals to have a more secure and reliable supply of their supply, you know, products, you know, masks and generic drugs and so forth, hospital administrators are smart people and they would figure out how to get that done. Is my opinion. I hope that's cool.
Let's hear from reasonable person Aaron. Your hand up.
Thanks very much. So I guess one of the issues with the generic drug market is that we have very few choices, especially in the hospital. So here's an example. There's a drug called protamine. We needed to do cardiac surgeries. We have one choice, one supplier. We keep a healthy supply on this. We don't want to run out. We keep like 2 months on hand. The supplier has a manufacturing problem and there's none to be had. How does a situation like that, because this is, you can multiply that situation by 100 for the hospital market. How do you fix that situation with contracting where there's one company and they may or may not choose to do a good job?
You develop a second contract with another company.
There's one supplier, one company.
Currently, if you paid, I don't know, if you paid 10 times what you're paying, just to, you know, if you paid 10 times as much, there would be more suppliers. I guarantee. If you paid 5 times as much, you'd have something. Teva Farms, you know, I don't know. I'll take, you know, Teva Pharmaceuticals. I have no financial interest in them whatsoever. They produce a wide range of generic drugs. The example I mentioned of vincristine is interesting. Pfizer was making it. I guess they made the drug originally, and then Teva got into it, but they got out of it again because they couldn't make money because they weren't being paid enough. If you paid more, there'd be 2 suppliers. If you paid a lot more, there'd be 5 suppliers. That's, you know, so if you want to, again, it's like the FedEx, you know, yeah, you can use the post office and most of the time they'll deliver on time, But if you absolutely positively need it overnight, you go to FedEx and you pay some more. So I think, and again, I think there are some, I'll just say breakdowns in prioritization within hospitals, that if you really, really need this stuff, and it's devastating not to get it, and I'm sure it is devastating for some people. You would have a backup contractor who would say, look, I can't live without this. I have one supplier now. I will pay, a king's ransom. Again, to take an extreme example, I will pay a king's ransom to get a second source of supply. Can you do that? And for enough money, they'll say yes.
But I think it's who's paying, right? Because you're wanting the hospitals to bear the entire risk. But I mean, the government is the biggest payer, right?
No, you put
need more money that way.
Yeah. No, I think you put it on, I think I guess an alternative approach is you go to your one supplier and you say, you can't have any supply breakdowns. If you have a supply breakdown, I'm going to fine you $10 million an hour. Again,
who does that fine? Who does that fine though?
No, the hospital does. I mean, contracting, contracts have breach of contract provisions all the time. Force majeure, tough noogies. If the world if there's no nuclear war, you have to deliver. It's just a matter of contracting. And again,
I think it's hard though for like an individual hospital to do that. We don't have a lot of buying power.
But I think I'm sure every hospital is kind of in the same situation. It's the same way markets don't always work, especially in healthcare. There's a lot of challenges. I agree. Quality is hard to measure. Healthcare, surgery is an extraordinarily complex product, and it's hard to measure quality, hard to compare it. It's hard for markets to work in many cases. Buying generic drugs is not a case where markets don't work, in my opinion. Buying generic drugs is straightforward. There should be a contracting way out of this. And maybe, like I said, maybe Medicare needs to pay to subsidize this and say, you know what, we're going to pay for every surgery, we're going to pay 1% more for hospitals that have had no supply problems, in the last, and then you got to get into measuring how you measure that. And there's some challenges, sure. But it's a solvable problem, I think. There's some good discussion on the chat. So, but which I was happy to do when I wasn't the guy on the hot seat. But it's a little harder to follow.
I'll let others go, Wally.
Than I am. I mean, again, reasonable people could disagree. You're an expert. You work at a hospital. I don't.
So don't worry about trying to answer the chat questions here. Phil.
Okay, I'm just if people want to raise them, it might be easier if people just want to raise the chat question.
Yeah, and hopefully we will. Lee, you're next up. Why don't you go ahead and keep this going?
Sure. Right. So, I appreciate the fact that cost data are really hard to find, right? I mean, these are strategically sensitive data. And so companies have an incentive not to be so forthcoming. But to cite a counter example to the one you did, Wally, I mean, if we look at the entire medical device sector and the entire pharmaceutical sector before the COVID pandemic, imports were growing a lot faster than domestic production, right? So assuming that the companies are doing a good job of maximizing profit, right, then the total cost of sourcing production outside the US is presumably moving, in a favorable direction relative to the total cost of producing in the US, even allowing for the miracles of modern automation. There are surely particular examples or subsectors where automation completely swamps the labor and other factor cost difference. But in the aggregate, it seems to be getting relatively cheaper for companies to make stuff abroad, which is presumably why they're making more stuff abroad, right? And I think even a 20 to 50% cost differential is pretty substantial, right? I mean, healthcare in the United States is expensive, right? And while, the biggest expense is not the price of drugs and devices, right? If you were to raise that across the board by 20 to 50%, it would be a non-trivial impact on the system,
Yeah.
Right. And, the ultimate, payers are going to be healthcare consumers, right? Who are paying either in the form of higher insurance premiums or higher prices or higher taxes. Right.
Just to ballpark that a little bit. So my guesstimate is that sterile injectable drug spending in the US is, I don't know, between $5 and $10 billion a year. So real money, although compared to the $3 trillion we spend on healthcare, not that much. I had a number for N95 masks, but it's in like it's a few billion. But yeah, and 30% of that is a real number, and Aaron is right. Are hospitals going to spend more money on stuff just out of the goodness of their whatever, just for fun, or just because like, oh well, China's cheaper, but we'll just buy in the US because we're nice people or something or whatever. Yeah, no, they want to control costs. I get it.
Right. So these are real dollars, right? Yeah. And the other point I want to make is that maybe it would be worth spending these real dollars, right? Or maybe more precisely, forcing American patients, come taxpayers, to pay these higher dollars if it were actually buying us complete insurance against another pandemic-like event. Mm-hmm. But what I want to propose is that it may be buying us almost no insurance against the next pandemic event, because what domestically situated producers will do is scale their production capacity to meet expected demand. Mm-hmm. Right? The Medtronic guy said this about 5 different ways, 5 different times. In a normal year, you're not having a pandemic.
Right.
Right. So there's no way that even an expensive policy that moved a lot of this production onshore would insure us against a pandemic related shortfall, because they're going to build to meet expected demand, not the demand that would emerge in the next medical.
Well, unless you pay them extra for the, you have to have, you essentially, you can pay for idle capacity. You can pay, one idea if somebody's kicked around was, you pay for stockpiling, but you roll it over, and you actually, because stocks, they run out. So you're, or you're just maintaining a hot production line for you're just making N95 masks and maybe you're throwing them in the ocean, but you need the capacity. We do this.
Okay, but you could stockpile
all the time, right?
But you can stockpile with that onshoring, right? Yeah. And you could also pay for excess capacity to the extent that those contracts are, enforceable and reliable. You could buy excess capacity outside the United States as well as in it, right? So I guess, what I'd like to, as my humanities colleagues say, interrogate, right, or problematize, is the idea that onshoring gives us, insurance against a pandemic style event, right? Or it buys us excess production capacity to deal with that kind of event, because it doesn't. These are separate issues. Right.
I think that this is a question of where the technological details matter. Some people will make the case that if you have production facilities domestically, they can be expanded much more rapidly than new production facilities could be built. And so, but that depends on what you're producing and what it takes to expand it. So there may be products for which, the production is scalable enough such that even if you're sizing your production capacity to meet expected demand, that you could ramp up in the case of a pandemic much more rapidly than you could import the, production capacity from scratch.
Well, maybe, but you've got domestic and foreign production capacity, right? So, I still, I'm sort of pushing this point that the scaling up problem, which is a real one, right, is actually separable from the onshoring problem. And a lot of the current policy debate is conflating the two. And we could actually play a socially constructive role by separating these out and showing how they are not the same thing.
I agree.
Okay, I'll stop.
That's absolutely right. And I think that if we were to simply say, let's impose tariffs to try to equalize it and provide a financial incentive for firms to produce some, at least domestically, what we wind up with is the things for which it's the gap is relatively narrow. but not for which that it would necessarily provide us with a socially beneficial protection in the case of a pandemic. So it's a very blunt instrument to start just, throwing money at inducing producers to produce domestically. Now, what the
I mean, you could have a different. I mean, you could certainly have a different tariff rate for different things. If
you'd have to, right?
If you have to be 100% tariff for
Yep.
one thing and 30% for the other to make domestic production viable, then
the executive order study ducked this, right? They basically said, okay, what the FDA needs to do is find the 50 most essential medicines, and now we're going to basically, force some domestic production of those things, right? Or
maybe, yeah, yes,
right. But basically, it's very unspecific, right? And how one would do that, because you'd have to. I mean, could you do such a thing? Basically pick each of these things and provide a differential, incentive for each one of them. I mean, I guess you could.
Theoretically, I mean, at some point, yeah, you become the Soviet minister for central planning,
but see, then you're in the business forever, because now you're going to have to monitor, the changes in technology and, on the medical side as well as the production side and so forth, and continue to change these incentives to make this work. It would be a nightmare of central planning to try to make that work. So anyway, let's go to other people with other ideas. George.
Thank you. So Phil, is this paraphrasing proper to say that in your view, transparency may not do much because there's not a strong willingness to pay for quality or resiliency, let's say in the pharmaceutical market? Is that an accurate?
That's pretty much. I mean, I think transparent. If there was a willingness to pay, the transparency would help. If not, then the transparency won't do much.
Right, and I think so I'd like your thought on this. So I do research on this, the pharmaceutical quality, transparency, generics to originals, and what I believe is the case is the willingness to pay for quality is there, and it's not just the transparency, but it's interpretability of the transparency. So if you told me this drug was made in China, then India, and then it came to the US, I might not care. If you told me that its potency compared to the original drug is 60% of what it should be, I got to imagine that all of a sudden the willingness to pay is there in a way that we don't even realize in the US, because the going assumption from the FDA is generics and originals are identical quality. Don't question it. They're the same. So there is no need for transparency because nobody's thought about a willingness to pay for quality. It's kind of been taken out of our jargon. Like the quality is the same, so transparency is meaningless. So I guess my question is it if the transparency was very interpretable, so that an average consumer could look at their bottle and realize that their pharmacist had just given them 80% of the quality level of the original drug, that person might go back to CVS and say, no, I'll pay $10 more, give you the 90%. Do you think that's a realistic vision of how it could be?
Possibly, relying on the consumers in healthcare is a challenge because, I don't know, they only pay, you have to have insurance, but once you have insurance, you're pretty insulated from the true price.
So when I say consumer,
it wouldn't hurt. Yeah, I mean, but buyers, hospital buyers, Aaron and colleagues, that wouldn't hurt. I guess I was making the assumption that, when they get deliveries of, sterile injectable drugs, they can tell if they've been contaminated. They can tell. No, all right. So corrected.
This is so. Let me just add one more comment. That as I was thinking about the two things, resiliency and quality, my perspective, and I'd love others' opinion, is that the big purchasers would pay for the resiliency if it was really interpretable, and the consumers would care and potentially pay more about the quality, right? The hospital might care a little, but I might care a lot, right? If I'm taking a chemotherapy drug and I could pay twice as much for a more effective drug, I would care. But I don't think I would care as much about resiliency because I trust the pharmacy's going to have it. And I think that's where the hospital system would pay for the resiliency transparency. The consumer might pay for the quality transparency.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. let's keep going. Remember, our goal here is to try to make sure that we're guiding Phil toward questions that could be answered that will help us do a better job in our study. So with that in mind, Craig, what do you have on your mind?
Well, in part, it's something that Ash had put on the chat page, and that is what sort of constitutes onshoring. Is Canada and Mexico part of onshore? And one could do an economic analysis of would there be a benefit to that approach to onshoring from an economic standpoint? That is, maybe Mexico's prices would be close to India and the quality would be something we would have a closer look on. I'm thinking of the auto industry now. You produce in Windsor, you produce down on the Maquiadora, right? And you put the car together in Detroit or Ohio or wherever you're putting it together. Is there economic data that would allow you to make some analysis to, instead of total domestic inside the lower 48, but we view ourselves as a hemispheric onshore. And for instance, Pfizer was dependent on raw materials being produced in Vancouver, et cetera, and of course, there's benefits to both of those countries as our neighbors as well. So there's foreign policy impact, I suppose. But is there a case that you could make an economic analysis of, let's say we pulled it back to the North American hemisphere, what would that be like in terms of the economic impact? Lower labor rates in Mexico, but maybe similar rates in Canada, yada, yada, yada. I'm a doc, I'm not an economist.
Possibly. Again, it's particularly, it's been hard enough to me to get actual factual information about what things cost now. So getting into the hypotheticals of what they would cost is even more challenging. Certainly one could say use, data on, I don't know how much, so like some level, production in Mexico, production in the US, you have some of the same trade-offs between lower labor costs and automation. So you could, I guess, assume that, the price difference between the US and Mexico in producing, drugs or PPE is the same as the ratio for cars and apply something like that. But, you're getting, I don't know. So
Canada, for instance, has no vaccine self-sufficiency because all the international companies moved out of Canada.
Right.
Merck and Glaxo and those folks pulled their people out of Canada.
Right.
Now they're putting money into Sanofi, which is another international owned company, 700 million for them to open up building 2 for vaccine production up there. Again, I don't know if how you get the economic data is the challenge. I guess is what you're saying, but it's a model that is worth thinking about. I don't know if there's economic data, but anyway.
Sorry, Aslam?
Hi. So I have 2 things to say. One is going back to the previous discussion about, ratings and the consumers' willingness to pay or incentives. And I felt like the discussion did not include the perception and price elasticity of consumers to risk. And I think that's a big issue because usually people are willing to pay if, for example, as George put it, if you say like this drug has 80% efficacy of the other one and here's the price difference. However, if you tell them, there is an 60% likelihood of this drug is going to run out during your treatment on the 8th week, it could be like, you can't even say that, right? That's a very hard thing to say. If you said it that way, it could be something meaningful. But I think in drug shortages, we're almost like, it's not just the quality, right? It's the shortages. And it's very hard to explain that in a way for the consumers to pay. I work in global health emergency response and humanitarian response. And this is like the one big issue that people even if it happens to them, they forget about it, right? If it doesn't happen for 2 years, people are not going to evacuate. Even someone tells them like there's an 80% likelihood that your house is going to get flooded. So I think in that discussion, I think we also have to talk about what is the willingness of the people to pay for risk, and of course this is all about insurance and all of that. But anyway, that's one thing I wanted to add to that discussion. The second thing I was thinking about, the lack of data, which is not surprising at all. It's very hard for data to find. I was wondering if you went the other way around. So you looked for drugs and products that are on the risk and, like that were specific. I was wondering if you just forget about that selection criteria and looked for drugs and products that are actually being produced both here and outside and in various parts of the world, and maybe with some, I don't know, differences in quality. I don't even know. I'm a supply chain person. I'm not a pharmacist like Erin, so I wouldn't know. But I was wondering if there is a way to actually canvas the space to try to find things that are produced in multiple places, maybe not necessarily even just US, but like something similar in another place, and try to understand what the price differences are and where is it kind of coming from. That's one suggestion that I was thinking about, like how to solve this problem. That's it.
All right, I'll try to answer your first question first if I can, and then I'll try to at the same time think of an answer to your second question. So on that, I guess one thing to say is, in general, I think economists have found that people do a lousy job of dealing with low probability, high cost events. They tend to overestimate the chance that they'll happen to them. Kind of over-insure, like, I don't know, people buy, the extended warranty for things, which is a waste of money usually. And, so it's hard for them to assess these kinds of things in general. And also in particular, in the case of health insurance, usually you don't know what it costs until after the fact. So unfortunately, my wife went through had cancer last year. She went through chemotherapy. So I've, experienced this personally. Fortunately, she's doing fine, and, we didn't have any shortages. But, I got the bill, months later, I don't know. She took the drug that her oncologist said she should take. Yep. The consumer has a pretty limited role. Some people disagree about this and feel like, the problem with healthcare is that consumers aren't empowered enough, and you have high deductible plans and so forth. And even that people hate this stuff. They're not like me. They're not interested in health insurance, and they don't want to deal with it. So I wouldn't put too much on that. On the second point about, different sources, if I understood the question right, and I apologize if I didn't. I guess I think the evidence I look at is, if the margins are there, then companies solve this problem, as people have said. Brand name drugs, no shortages, because the companies make a lot of money every time they sell a drug. So, and this is in the report, the Biden report too, right? They've got plans up the wazoo.
Yeah, and it's not really a question. I was not trying to pose a question. I was trying to make a suggestion that maybe you could look for drugs like that. Maybe it's a meaningful
well, so there's a lot of them. And I think maybe as Lee or somebody said, getting people to divulge, confidential price information is hard.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Like maybe look at the market prices, like market prices of.
They're often not observed. They're really, that's another, it's kind of circular logic here, right? Market prices in healthcare are hard to observe. I can observe what Medicare pays for things.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Which and I'm sure Erin would be the first to jump in and say, well, that's not a market price. That's just, what Medicare decides to pay. Private prices are very hard and can be, I don't know, you can pay a lot and get a data set, but I don't think we're talking like the time frame that you need. So I'll think about it some more. I'm sorry if I'm kind of reacting, pessimistically, but like I said, this has all been, I mean, I've been working on this for a month and a half or something. This has just been much harder than I thought it was going to be, and so I'm trying to be realistic about what I can. I want to. As I said, my goal is to deliver something useful to you, and I will do my best to do that. But I don't know that could be a bridge too far.
So if I can just jump in, since we're running up against we're past our time on this. We have kind of two things here. One is, the recommendations that we want to make, and I don't think that we're actually after a recommendation that says that the FDA should collect all the data in the world and basically impose a decision on the market. I mean, that would be an insanely impossible thing to implement. The other, though, is data to illustrate our points, sort of how much cost does this impose on the market to go down the onshoring path? I mean, Lee has pointed out that just watch what the free market has done, right? Which is, they have not gone to Mexico,
right?
Even with some incentives, they certainly have not come to the U.S., right? So at least within the margins of their profit, the cost differentials are high enough to keep them out. So it's clear that there is a cost to be borne if we're going to go down this path. Then there's the question of what is the benefit? And then it goes into this stuff like scalability. Are we really buying scalability by locating here? Because I think that what the Congress people are thinking is basically it comes down to seizing supply. Is that if we are producing our domestic supply, and a pandemic hits, then wherever it's being produced it's basically going to go there. And if it were being produced here, then we'd be able to seize it, right? We can apply that. How much of a benefit is that?
Yeah,
anyway,
I like to think that. I mean, like I said, at least now I have two more data points today than I had yesterday, which is in percentage terms an incredible improvement. Right. So API is 50% more expensive, and PPE is, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30. That's these.
Let's go to other people with any ideas on where we might take this. Mashi?
Yes, hi. Just a comment and then a suggestion. So the comment is on patient perceptions or preferences around generic drugs versus brand names. And I would have to say that in my clinical practice, I'm an emergency physician. You would be surprised how often. So let's say I'm refilling a medicine. Oh, doc, make sure you don't do the generic. That never works for me, or I get side effects. Or that, oh, what are you doing? What is this medicine? How much is it going to cost me? Do I really need the CAT scan? So I think we don't give patients as much credit, frankly. And I think in this day and age, everyone has Dr. Google, so they're Googling stuff. And some patients don't care. I agree, but I don't even know that it's necessarily the majority, to be honest with you. So I think we should take that into consideration, and Erin may have thoughts on that, and Asha as well. The idea I had is the following. So I think what would be interesting is kind of a model that looks at the trade-offs between onshoring versus diversification of portfolio and offshoring, and basically looking at the costs versus benefits of potentially onshoring. So, for example, quality issues or timely delivery issues. I mean, I think that having an understanding of, if you are going in the direction of onshoring, what are the costs for that in dollar signs, and in other, to society more broadly, to patients, to healthcare systems, and then on the flip side, offshoring, and where is the fine balance here, and where should the balance be routinely and then for emergency situations. So I think that would be interesting. Thank you for all the information you offered today, Phil. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mashid. Alistair?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating discussion, but then it seems to me, Phil, that one thing we've not considered are the costs that are not borne by the company, but are borne by society. So the area we're looking at, or one of the areas we're looking at specifically, are drugs. The FDA is supposed to inspect manufacturing plants. It doesn't do it. But if they charged an economical rate for inspecting plants in India, there'd be a major difference in the costs of manufacturing, onshoring and offshoring. I'm not advocating for onshoring, incidentally, but right now we're ignoring a major cost that actually reflects in quality. So inspections no inspections have occurred in China in the last 18 months, for example, even though they're supposed to have occurred. Even before the pandemic, very few inspections were occurring in India and China because of difficulty in getting visas. So if companies were forced to bear the cost of that in dollar terms, that would change the equation quite substantially and potentially have a quality benefit. So we're essentially saying that the manufacturer gets to keep the bonus from manufacturing outside the US, but the taxpayer pays for the extra costs of even the most simple example of flying the inspectors to India.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think broader
So we could
you can subsidize you can subsidize production in America or tax in some way, raise the, perhaps, production overseas is not priced correctly because, there are costs that should be borne by the manufacturer that aren't.
Right. I mean, it costs a lot less to send an inspector to Chicago than it does to send them to somewhere in India. We compared to, in another committee I was on, one of the problems apparently is that it's very hard to get inspectors to stay on the job because they don't want to be away in India or China for weeks on end.
Yeah. I like that point, Alistair. It's kind of like you're talking about the fully landed social cost of these things, right?
Exactly, right.
And that it's not just the cost under good times. There's a social cost to this inspection. There's a social cost when we have quality problems. There's a social cost when we have a discontinuity of supply. There's a social cost associated with all the people that are in Aaron's, industry, monitoring and dealing with these shortages.
There's a social cost of not doing the inspections, and that's
there is absolutely.
So
absolutely.
if we incentivize the inspections financially, so that it became worthwhile for people to do these inspections, we get to a more level playing field.
Can I ask, is there something preventing the FDA from hiring Indian nationals and having an office in India?
Yeah, we're often at a different point, but Rob may want to comment on this, but we heard very explicitly from FDA about how difficult it was to retain people to do this job. It was difficult.
Yes.
It was difficult to keep
the FDA. I'm sorry, Alistair. Go ahead.
Well, you can talk to this better than I can, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a corporation, right, you would just hire nationals from the country that you're interested in. The FDA can't do that. There's some law that prohibits it from happening. And so the cost of sending an FDA employee to China, for example,
right,
is between 500,000 and $1 million a year per person.
Mm-hmm. And the difficulties of even identifying the factory is enormous because the names and numbers change all the time, and it's hard to. So I mean, we don't want to get into that right now, but it seems to me that we have to look at the total cost of these things rather than just the cost to the company.
It is a challenge, I will say. I read an early conversation with Wally. I'm sure it would be very useful to the committee if I could also quantify not just the cost of the options, but the benefits. But the benefit side does seem harder because then you have to get into, well, what is the cost to patients of, not getting their chemotherapy in a timely manner or getting a less effective drug, and again, all things I'm sure Aaron can speak to very well. Having, what's the cost of reusing your N95 mask for a week rather than, once a day, or things like that. It's important. But I'm a little bit stuck looking under the streetlight sometimes, unfortunately.
Right. But what if we didn't try to do that in a precise or general way, but rather came up with an illustrative example of, all right, let's try to do what Alistair was just talking about and talk about the full social cost and just list all the categories, swag some numbers, that we could get from various sources just to basically put this in play and talk about, well, what would have to be the case?
What's the break even or something? Yeah.
Exactly. What would the break even look like? How would you get there? I mean, I'm not suggesting we would have any level of precision about that, but at least we have a,
right.
a way to look at this.
And it's not just dollars, it's the ease of inspection. For just sticking with inspection, it's the ease of inspection. Inspections that don't occur don't improve quality. Inspections that do occur and are easy to implement maybe do.
Yeah, then you get into tricky things of cost effectiveness. It's kind of like, how many dollars would you spend to avoid, what excess morbidity because
dollars per life saved or dollars per quality or something.
Yeah. I mean, it would start to get complicated, but at least if we had the categories there and pretend you could attach dollar values to things and start there, I'm just
that makes sense.
trying to find a way that we could, supplement the report with some insights into this onshoring thing that, the EO study just didn't go anywhere with this. They didn't even try. And it seems like, given our mandate, we have to try something. We have to say something about this. And we want to say something intelligent, right? We don't want to just, kind of say, well, the market doesn't do it.
There's a lot of considerations, right.
Because this is likely that whether the markets want to do this or not, it's very likely that, given it, their preferences that they've observed so far, that onshoring might be a policy that the government would pursue here. So if we're going to inform some policy, it'd be our chance.
And it could be really useful, Wally, to not only look at the costs versus benefits of onshoring, but other alternative strategies that might also mitigate the quality problem, the resiliency problem, and the scalability problem. And it may turn out that there's a much cheaper way to get there than by moving the global pharmaceutical industry into the physical boundaries of the United States.
Okay. I think that's probably a pretty good place to leave this. So Phil, we're going to have to go back into our closed session and talk to each other. And Lisa and I will get back to you.
Terrific.
Sort of any guidance that we can come up with here. So
thank you
so much for all your work here, and we really appreciate the time.
Thank you all for your time and your very helpful comments. They're greatly appreciated.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I think this concludes the open part of our program. So thank you very much to anybody who's online, and for all of the committee members. We're going to flip back and go to the closed side once again. So see you in a few.